At my mom's funeral, Dad forbade me to speak, so I played her last words. Then the new will was, "My name is Carla Rockmore. I'm 34 years old, a freelance interior designer based in Portland, Oregon. I used to teach at a small but respected design college on the east side of the city before the program was restructured, and I was quietly removed in favor of someone younger and more obedient. That was 2 years ago, and I haven't set foot in a classroom since. I now work mostly alone, restoring mid-century homes and doing space planning for clients I rarely meet in person. It's quiet work, solitary, but at least I don't have to fake smiles in faculty meetings or explain myself to men who think muted palates are a personality trait. I live in the same house I grew up in, a cedar-framed 2-bedroom tucked under the trees, filled with the smell of old pine and faint watercolor pigment. The house used to belong to my mother, Miriam, and though I have technically inherited it, I still think of it as hers. Every time I walk into the kitchen and hear the soft creak of the cabinet doors or see the patch of sunlight that hits the floor near the fridge, I see her, standing barefoot with her sleeves rolled up, humming while she mixed colors in a chipped porcelain bowl. Miriam Rockmore died 3 weeks ago. Stage 4 ovarian cancer. It was quick, too quick. By the time she told me, the doctors had already told her there wasn't much they could do. I asked her why she waited so long. She just smiled, that quiet, careful smile of hers, and said, "You were already carrying too much." I didn't know what she meant at the time. I do now. My mother was a painter, not professionally. She rarely showed her work, almost never sold it. But her art was everywhere. Our home was layered with it. Her canvases leaned against walls. Her sketches curled beneath mugs. Her thoughts lived in colors. Growing up, I used to think she was soft, almost passive. But that was before I learned that silence can be an armor when your husband refuses to hear you and your son sees only his own reflection. My father, Martin Rockmore, is a retired contractor who used to run a modest construction firm. He's the kind of man who speaks in commands, wears clean jeans on Sundays, and measures affection in things like mortgage payments and furniture weight limits. He was never violent, not in the way people expect, but his control was total. He decided where we lived, who we could invite over, and what counted as real success. Art, in his opinion, was just clutter, a waste of time and talent. My mother never argued with him in front of us. She just kept painting quietly, usually in the basement, sometimes in the laundry room. She called it her private world. And now I understand that she had to create one because the public world, her own family, had no place for her voice. My younger brother, Leo, is his father's son, slick, articulate, always dressed like he just walked out of a real estate billboard in Manhattan. He moved to New York right after college and only came back for holidays, which he treated like corporate networking events. To outsiders, he was the golden child, ambitious, sharp, a leader. To me, he was just a curated illusion, built on photo captions and charm. Whenever he spoke to Mom, it was with forced warmth, like he was reading off a script, but she loved him anyway. That was her flaw. She loved us both even when we didn't deserve it. The last month of her life, I stayed by her side every day. I managed her medication, spoon-fed her soup, and helped her to the bathroom when she was too weak to walk. My father visited only when necessary. Leo didn't even come until the week she died. He brought flowers from a hotel gift shop and spent most of the time pacing around the room while checking his emails. On the last night, when she could barely speak, she reached for my hand and whispered, "Don't let them bury my truth." I didn't know what she meant. I just held her hand and nodded, because there was nothing else I could do. The next morning, she was gone. My father handled the funeral arrangements with clinical precision, as if it were a conference to be managed. He booked a large venue, invited dozens of people I'd never met, and positioned himself as the grieving husband everyone admired. I asked if I could say a few words. He didn't even look up from his seating chart when he replied, "No, it's not necessary. Keep the focus on her, not yourself." I opened my mouth to object, but then I saw Leo standing beside him, arms folded, lips curved into something that looked like a smirk. So I didn't argue. I just nodded and left the room. But later that night, I went back to the house and opened the small wooden box where Mom used to keep her watercolor brushes. Inside was a flash drive wrapped in tissue paper and a folded note in her handwriting. "Play this when they try to silence me." I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table, listening to the wind move through the trees outside, my fingers tracing the grooves of the USB drive. I knew that voice, that tone. My mother had left me something, and whatever it wasn't meant to stay hidden. I didn't open the file right away. Something about the way she'd written that note made me hesitate, as if hearing her voice again might break me. The flash drive stayed in my coat pocket for 3 days, traveling with me from room to room like a stone I couldn't put down. I'd touch it absent-mindedly while making tea, feel it press against my ribs when I leaned into the couch, and every time I tried to forget it was there, it reminded me she wasn't. I finally played it on the 4th night, after everyone had gone home and the quiet had thickened into something sharp. I didn't even plug it into a computer. I just used the old digital voice recorder she used when documenting her painting process. It crackled to life with a soft buzz, and then her voice came through dry, raspy, but unmistakably hers. She started by saying her full name, clearly and slowly. "This is Miriam Ann Rockmore, and if you're hearing this, I'm no longer here." She paused, almost as if she were listening for something. Then she went on. She talked about her life, the choices she made, the silences she accepted, and the love she held on to for too long. She didn't sound angry. That was the part that hurt the most. She just sounded tired, like someone who had spent a lifetime making herself small so that other people could feel bigger. She spoke of my father and Leo, not with hate, but with a kind of distant clarity. She said they were men who had learned to measure worth by control and success, not by presence or tenderness. She said she had always known they would rewrite the story after she was gone, paint themselves as devoted caretakers, and minimize her pain as background noise. Then she spoke about me. She said I had never let her feel invisible, that I was the only one who sat with her when the chemo made her sick, the only one who held her hand without rushing out the door. "Carla," she said, her voice almost breaking, "you were the only one who stayed." She ended by saying she had made arrangements for the truth to be known and that someone named Emily had the rest. I hadn't heard that name in years. Emily Cates. She had been my student back when I was still teaching. Quiet, meticulous, bright. She had graduated early and gone on to law school. I remembered thinking she was going to build something meaningful with her life. Apparently, she had. And now she was my mother's lawyer. I found her number tucked into the back of my mother's old day planner. I called her the next morning, not knowing what I'd say. She picked up on the second ring. "Carla," she said, her voice steady but warm. "I've been waiting for your call." I didn't ask how she knew. Some part of me was too tired to question the details anymore. We agreed to meet that afternoon at a small cafe downtown. The kind of place with hanging plants and acoustic jazz playing too softly to notice. When I arrived, she was already seated by the window, dressed in a black turtleneck with her hair pinned back, looking more like an architect than a lawyer. She didn't waste time with condolences. Instead, she slid a folder across the table, her eyes never leaving mine. "Your mother updated her will 3 weeks before she passed. She said, 'It's fully legal, notarized, and witnessed.' But she asked me not to reveal it unless you were denied a voice at her funeral." I blinked, caught between disbelief and something colder. She knew they'd silence me. I said quietly. Emily nodded. She expected it. I opened the folder with trembling fingers. The new will was clear. My father was no longer the primary heir. Neither was Leo. The house, the accounts, even the residuals from the small gallery that still sold a few of her older pieces, everything now came to me. But more than that, there was a letter, handwritten, dated 2 days before she died. "If they try to silence you," it said, "don't raise your voice. Play mine instead." I walked out of that cafe with the will in my bag, the letter in my coat pocket, and a stillness in my chest I couldn't quite name. It wasn't victory. It wasn't relief. It was something deeper, like the quiet just before a storm. The funeral was in 2 days. I already knew I wouldn't be speaking, but I also knew I wouldn't be silent. The day of the funeral arrived beneath a gray sky that seemed too fitting to be coincidence. Portland has a way of mourning quietly, with cold light and slow rain, and that morning felt like the city itself had decided to grieve with me. I arrived at the church just before the guests did. My father was already inside, adjusting details like a project manager reviewing a pitch. The flower arrangements were excessive, the music somber and dramatic. I could tell he had spared no expense, not out of love, but out of need for appearance, for control, for the narrative he wanted the world to see. Leo arrived late, of course, wearing a black designer suit that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. He greeted distant relatives like a celebrity doing charity work, offering practiced nods and half hugs, his face set in a mask of gentle sorrow. When he approached me, he didn't say a word, just looked me up and down, as if calculating how much space I should be allowed in this performance. I didn't speak either. There was no point. The pews slowly filled with neighbors, friends of the family, old clients of my father's construction firm, even some of my mother's students from the art therapy classes she used to host at the community center. Most of them wore black. Some wore guilt. None of them really knew who my mother was. They knew the version that baked cookies for school events or helped decorate charity halls, but they didn't know about the days she locked herself in the laundry room to cry. They didn't know how many times she gave up her own dreams so the men in the house could chase theirs. As the ceremony began, my father took the stage with a posture I knew too well, shoulders back, voice steady, tone carefully modulated. He talked about her as a loving wife, a quiet strength behind the family, a woman who stood by him through everything. He said those words like they were medals, not weights she carried in silence. Leo followed him, more polished, more emotive, quoting poetry he didn't understand and recalling childhood memories that he had barely participated in. The audience nodded. Some even dabbed their eyes. I sat still, my hands folded, the flash drive in my coat pocket pressing against my ribs like a heartbeat. When the final song ended and the pastor signaled the service was done, I stood up. My father noticed immediately and stepped forward to intercept me. He didn't raise his voice, He didn't need to. He leaned in, close enough so only I could hear, and said, "Not now. Carla, don't ruin this. Let her rest." I looked him straight in the eye and answered calmly, "She never rested." Dad. Not while she was alive. I moved past him without pushing, without raising my voice, and walked straight to the small control panel where the sound system was wired. I knew the room layout. My mother had painted a mural for this church once. I had come here often as a child, not because I believed, but because she needed the quiet. I plugged the flash drive into the system and hit play. The room fell into an awkward silence, a few people whispering, some turning to look at me. Then her voice filled the room, not the weak, dying voice we heard at the hospital. This was the voice she recorded weeks earlier, before the pain had hollowed her out. She introduced herself again, formally, as if reading into court record. She spoke of her life with Martin Rockmore, a man who gave her stability but not warmth, structure but never softness. She spoke about how silence became a strategy, how she learned to disappear in plain sight. Then she spoke of Leo. Her words weren't cruel, but they cut deeper than anything I could have said. She described him as charming but absent, as a man who learned early to trade affection for approval. He always smiled for the camera, she said, but never stayed long enough to wash a dish. And then she spoke of me. She said I was her mirror, the only one who noticed when her light dimmed, the one who stayed. Not because I had nowhere else to go, but because I saw her not as a mother, but as a woman. When her message ended, the room was utterly silent. Even the pastor looked unsure of what to say. I didn't need to explain anything. She had done it herself. Every word was hers, and now it was out there, undeniable, unedited. My father's face was pale, tight with rage. He didn't know where to direct. Leo looked stunned, like a man whose carefully built image had just been struck by lightning. I turned to face them both, but said nothing. My silence wasn't weakness. It was choice, and it was enough. After the recording ended, I stepped away from the sound system without saying another word. There was no need. The silence in the room had changed. It was no longer the quiet of ceremony, but the kind that settles in after something undeniable has been said. I could feel people staring, not with shock exactly, but with the weight of understanding. For the first time in my life, I didn't shrink under that weight. I stood in it. I let it settle. I walked back to my seat as my father stood frozen beside the casket, his hand still gripping the program he had carefully designed for the day, the one that didn't have my name anywhere near the list of speakers. Leo stayed seated, looking down at the floor as if trying to find a version of the day where he still came out clean. There wasn't one. The pastor stepped forward after a long pause, trying to regain control of the room, but the air had shifted. His closing words felt more like filler than comfort, and most people didn't stay long after. They left in waves, some whispering to each other, some nodding in my direction, their eyes soft but unreadable. A few older relatives looked at me with something close to regret. They had known my mother as the quiet wife of Martin, never questioning what that silence had cost her. Now they did. I stayed until the room emptied, my eyes on the floor near the pulpit, where the sunlight had begun to move. It felt right that she'd been heard there, not just remembered, but truly heard. That evening, I went back to the house alone. My father didn't return, and neither did Leo. The space felt different, as if the rooms themselves had exhaled. I didn't play the recording again. I didn't need to. Her words had settled into me like roots, and they were holding me upright. I pulled out the folder Emily had given me and began reviewing everything more carefully. The will was solid, every signature verified, every clause precise. But there was another document I hadn't noticed before, a timeline, handwritten by my mother in pencil, listing dates, account numbers, and transaction records. It wasn't legal, but it was meticulous. She had logged everything she had quietly saved, everything she had been denied access to, and the moments when my father or Leo had made decisions without her consent. Some were small joint account withdrawals, misfiled property records. Others weren't. One entry caught my eye immediately. It was dated 2 years ago, around the same time I had been let go from the college. I remembered that time clearly, not just because of the sudden job loss, but because of how withdrawn she had become. I had assumed it was about me, that my failure had embarrassed her, but the note said otherwise. Leo transferred Mom's name off second property title, claimed she agreed. She didn't. I blinked, trying to process what I was reading. My parents owned a second property, a small rental in Selwood. It had been part of their retirement plan, or at least that was what I had been told, apparently. Leo had used a forged authorization to transfer full ownership to himself, and my mother hadn't told anyone, not the police, not a lawyer, not even me. She had simply written it down and moved on, as if recording the injustice was all she could afford to do. I called Emily the next morning and asked if she knew anything about the Selwood property. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "I do, but I was waiting for you to find it on your own. Your mother wanted you to decide whether to pursue it." I asked her to send me whatever she had. Within the hour, I had copies of the deed, the signature pages, and the digital trail that showed Leo had filed everything online using a proxy account. It was sloppy, arrogant, and illegal, but I knew enough to recognize that a fight like this wouldn't be easy. Even with proof, it would take time, money, and stamina. Leo had resources, I had grief, some paper, and Emily. But maybe that was enough. That afternoon, I sat on the floor of my mother's old studio, surrounded by unfinished canvases and the scent of dried paint. I held the documents in my lap and thought about the years she spent in that room, quietly making beauty no one asked for, no one paid for, and no one praised. She had left me more than a will. She had left me evidence of what she endured, of what she observed, and of the life she lived behind closed doors. And now, the door was open. I didn't contact Leo right away, not because I was afraid of the confrontation, but because I knew the version of him that would respond wouldn't be honest. Leo was never one to admit fault. He didn't explain. He deflected. He didn't acknowledge harm. He reframed it. The kind of man who would look you in the eye and call a theft a strategic move, as if morality were just a tool some people couldn't afford to use. Instead, I went back to Emily and asked what it would take to challenge the title on the Selwood property. She didn't sugarcoat it. It would be a process. There'd be hearings, documents, responses from his legal team. "It's not about whether we win," she said quietly. "It's whether you're prepared to keep showing up." I was, not for revenge, not to humiliate him in court, but because I had finally seen the full cost of staying quiet, and I refused to carry that pattern forward. Within a week, we filed an official request to dispute the deed transfer. Citing fraud and misrepresentation, Leo didn't respond personally. His attorney did, a young man with too much cologne and too little shame, who called Emily to say the whole thing was a desperate attempt by a bitter daughter to rewrite family history. I didn't react. I had already expected that line. They always reduce women to bitterness when we don't make things easier for them. What I hadn't expected was the call from my father 3 days later. He didn't leave a message, just rang twice and then hung up. It was the first time he'd tried to contact me since the funeral. I called him back out of something closer to obligation than curiosity. He answered on the second ring, his voice lower than I remembered. "Carla," he said, like the word was heavy in his mouth. He didn't apologize. He didn't mention the recording or the will. Instead, he asked why I was stirring things up, now that everything was supposed to be settled. I let him speak until he ran out of air, then replied as calmly as I could. "You taught me that people earn what they fight for. I'm just following your logic." He went quiet, then sighed. "You always were too sensitive." I hung up without another word. From that moment on, the tone of everything shifted. Leo's lawyer became more aggressive. They filed countersuits, questioned my mental state, even implied in one motion that my mother had been manipulated into rewriting her will. Emily handled most of it with that surgical calm she was known for, but even she admitted they were playing dirty. I could have walked away. It would have been easy to say I had what mattered: the house, the memories, the truth. But the more they pushed, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about property anymore. It was about pattern. My mother had spent her life folding herself into corners to avoid making other people uncomfortable. She'd been erased from decisions, written out of her own financial future, made to feel like gratitude was the only thing she was allowed to express. I had lived with that legacy long enough. I wouldn't pass it forward. The real shift happened on a rainy Thursday morning when Emily received a file from a former paralegal who had briefly worked with Leo's firm. She had seen the forged authorization and saved a copy before leaving the firm a year ago. She hadn't thought much of it at the time, but when she heard about the case from a mutual friend, she reached out. The document was clear. The signature used to remove my mother's name from the title wasn't hers, not even close. It was a rushed copy, traced from an old check, and digitally pasted onto a power of attorney form that had never been notarized. We now had irrefutable evidence that the transfer was fraudulent. Emily looked at me across the table in her office and said, "We could end this quietly. Offer to drop everything if Leo returns the property and pays your legal costs, or we can take it public." I didn't answer immediately. I thought about the gallery that had once turned down my mother's submission because they weren't sure who had painted the work. I thought about the time Leo had introduced her at a networking brunch as our family's creative spirit, without ever mentioning she had studied at RISD. I thought about the years she spent believing that quiet loyalty was enough to keep people honest. Then I looked at Emily and said, "Take it public." The article came out on a Tuesday morning. No dramatic headline, no scandalized tones, just a quiet, detailed report in the city's independent paper, written by a journalist Emily trusted. It outlined the basics of the case: how the daughter of a late artist and homemaker was disputing the transfer of a family property, how inconsistencies in the paperwork had emerged, and how the evidence raised larger questions about silent financial control inside families. There were no names listed beyond mine, but anyone who had grown up in our part of Portland, anyone who had known my parents even from a distance, knew exactly who it was about. I expected backlash. I thought someone might call, accuse me of shaming the family. I waited for Leo to send one of his carefully worded rebuttals through his attorney, or for my father to issue some kind of damage control statement to our relatives. But nothing came. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was loaded. Friends of my mother started reaching out quietly, one by one. Women from her painting group, the receptionist from the community center, a neighbor who used to bring her oranges in the spring. They told me things I had never known, how my mother had been the one organizing scholarships for kids in the neighborhood, how she had once sold a painting and donated the proceeds anonymously to help a single mom fix her roof. She never told me these things. Maybe she thought I already carried enough, or maybe she believed they were too small to be worth mentioning, but they weren't. They were the proof of a woman who gave and gave, even as she was written out of her own narrative. I found myself thinking less about what Leo had taken and more about what my mother had left behind. Not the money, not even the house, but the quiet architecture of her character. How she had taught me to notice the things people don't say, to sit with silence until the truth slips out through the cracks. There was power in that, the kind that didn't need volume or spectacle. It was the kind that lingers, that changes people without forcing them to look directly. And that power, I realized, was starting to shift things. 2 weeks after the article, Leo called me, not through a lawyer, not by email, just called, like we were siblings again. I let it ring twice before I picked up. His voice was composed, the kind of polished calm that people mistake for control. He said he wanted to meet, not to argue, not to apologize, just to talk. I agreed, not because I trusted his intentions, but because I needed to look him in the eye and see if anything had cracked. We met at a small bistro near the edge of the city, the kind of place where no one knew our last name and no one cared what we were discussing. He arrived 10 minutes early, already seated, already sipping something dark with too much ice. When I sat down, he didn't speak right away. He just looked at me with that faint smile he used to wear at family dinners, the one that said everything was under control. But he didn't look in control anymore. He looked tired. He asked why I had gone public. I told him I didn't. Not really. That our mother did. The moment she recorded that message and handed me that flash drive, that I had simply refused to keep hiding her words. He sighed, set his glass down, and said something I didn't expect. You were always the one who stayed too quiet. I thought you'd fold. I didn't flinch. I had nothing left to defend. That's what you never understood. I said calmly, quiet doesn't mean weak. It just means patient. He didn't argue. He just nodded and asked if there was still time to fix things without dragging it through court. I told him the only way forward was restitution. Return the property, settle the legal costs, and put in writing that he forged our mother's name. He looked at me like I had asked for his spine, but then he agreed. Later, Emily told me she had expected a longer battle, but I wasn't surprised. Men like Leo live off perception. Once the illusion fractures, they scramble not to fix the truth, but to salvage the image. He wasn't admitting guilt out of remorse. He was surrendering out of strategy, and that was fine with me, because the outcome didn't need to be clean. It just needed to be just. The agreement was signed in a small conference room with beige walls and a humming overhead light that flickered slightly every time someone moved. There were no reporters, no courtroom drama, just 3 people and 2 pens. Leo didn't speak much during the meeting. He looked down as Emily read the terms aloud, nodding at the right moments. His jaw clenched like someone swallowing something sharp. I didn't look at him. I kept my eyes on the paperwork, on my mother's name printed clearly at the top, a name that had been erased and now reinstated with ink and intention. The forged document was formally revoked. the property returned to the estate, and the legal fees transferred to his account. Emily asked if he wanted to add any statement for the record. He shook his head. I said nothing after he left. Emily and I sat in silence for a moment. She didn't congratulate me. She didn't say you won or he lost. She just closed the folder and said, "This is what accountability looks like when it doesn't come with closure." And she was right. I didn't feel triumphant. There was no high, no rush, just a quiet sense of something complete, like the click of a locked door behind you. I walked out into the early evening air and stood on the steps of the building for a while. Watching traffic pass by without urgency, I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even sad. I was still. And in that stillness, there was space to breathe again. That weekend, I went back to the house and cleared out the last of my father's boxes. He hadn't asked for anything, just sent a text 2 weeks earlier saying he was settling elsewhere. I didn't ask where. I didn't need to know. I emptied the last dresser in what used to be his room and found a stack of old invoices from his construction business, along with a photo of my mother in her 20s. She wasn't smiling in the photo, just looking sideways at the camera, half amused, like someone who had already figured out the person taking it. I took the photo and placed it on the windowsill above the kitchen sink, where the light hit strongest in the morning. It felt like the right place. With the legal matters behind me, I began to spend more time in my mother's studio. I didn't paint. I wasn't her. But I organized the space, restored her brushes, labeled her unfinished work, and started cataloging the journals she left behind. They weren't formal diaries, just notebooks filled with sketches, thoughts, snippets of dreams, and occasional grocery lists written between lines of color swatches. I found pages where she had drawn the same shape over and over again, circles folding into spirals, then opening outward again, like breath. One journal had an entire section titled "Things I Didn't Say," filled with one-sentence reflections. Some were simple. I want to go to Venice. I don't like how he talks over me. I miss silence that doesn't feel like punishment. I read every line like a conversation she never got to finish. One entry stopped me, dated just a few months before she died. It read, "I wonder if Carla knows I watched her hold the world together with both hands and still apologize for not doing more." I set the notebook down and cried, not from grief, but from recognition, for years. I thought my mother never saw me, that she only looked at Leo as the one worth fighting for, but she had been watching, and more than that, she had understood. She had just chosen to keep that understanding quiet until I was ready to hear it. That night, I sat in the studio with the windows open and the city humming softly in the distance. The air smelled like dust and paint, and for the first time in a long while, the quiet didn't feel like absence. It felt like presence. I didn't need to prove anything anymore, not to my father, not to Leo, not even to myself. I had done what needed to be done, not for revenge, but for restoration. The legacy I inherited wasn't just property or money. It was clarity. It was courage that moves without spectacle. It was knowing when to speak and when to let silence carry the weight instead. Summer arrived slowly that year, as if the season itself was unsure whether it should stay. Portland light softened in the mornings, and the breeze carried the scent of old trees and sidewalk moss. I started opening the windows earlier, letting the air move through the house without apology. It had been 3 months since the legal case ended, and the days were no longer marked by tension or calls from lawyers. I spent most mornings in the studio, not painting, but restoring. I had begun a quiet project of cataloging my mother's work for a possible exhibit. Nothing grand, just something intimate, something honest. A retrospective not for acclaim, but for memory. I contacted the community art center where she used to teach, asked if they'd be willing to host a show of her pieces. They remembered her immediately. The woman on the phone got quiet when I said her name, then said, she used to bring her own snacks for the kids because the funding got cut. I never forgot that. We arranged for a date in late September, something small and local. I didn't invite many people, and I certainly didn't tell Leo or my father. It wasn't about making a statement. It was about creating a space where she could be seen fully, where her voice lived in color and canvas instead of just memory or legal record. Rebecca, my closest friend and former colleague, helped me set up the exhibit. She had been quiet through the entire ordeal, supportive in her way, always nearby but never pushing. As we hung one of my mother's largest pieces, a swirling blue and ochre landscape she painted during her treatment, Rebecca turned to me and said, "You know this isn't just about her anymore." Right? I nodded but didn't respond. Some things don't need confirming out loud. I had spent my whole life trying to shrink myself into places where others wouldn't feel threatened. And now, piece by piece, I was reclaiming that space, not as vengeance, but as repair. On the day of the exhibit, people showed up slowly, a few students, old neighbors, a woman from the grocery store who used to chat with my mom about the best brands of olive oil. One man brought his daughter and said he remembered when my mother painted a mural in his elementary school, one that had been painted over years ago. He looked around at the canvases and said softly, "She made things feel warm, even when nothing else did." I stood near the entrance most of the afternoon, letting people walk through, overhearing fragments of memory I had never known existed. I wasn't the host. I was the witness. Late in the afternoon, just as the light shifted into that golden stretch before dusk, Leo walked in. I hadn't invited him. I wasn't even sure how he found out. He looked around the room with careful eyes, his hands tucked into his coat pockets like a boy at a museum field trip. For a moment, I felt that old wave of dread rise, the one that came every time he entered a room and changed the air without touching a thing. But then I looked at him again and saw it clearly. He didn't come to posture. He came to see what he had missed. He didn't approach me right away. He walked the room slowly, pausing in front of pieces I knew he had never noticed when she was alive. When he finally came to stand beside me, he didn't say hello. He just whispered, "I didn't know she made all of this." I kept my eyes forward. "You didn't ask." He nodded. Then after a long silence, said, "She really left everything to you." It wasn't bitterness this time. It was acceptance, or maybe awe. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. A few moments later, he turned and walked out. No drama, no final words, just silence. And for the first time, it didn't feel like absence. It felt like peace. That night, after we packed everything and loaded the remaining pieces back into the van, I sat in the studio alone. I lit a candle, opened one of her notebooks, and read the first sentence I saw. "If one person sees me clearly, just one, it will have been enough." I closed the book and smiled, not because I had won, but because I finally understood what she meant. The weeks after the exhibit passed in quiet rhythm. I resumed my design projects slowly, mostly working with returning clients who had waited for me to come back on my own terms. The studio remained untouched, except for the mornings, when I'd sit beside the window with a notebook and a cup of black coffee, sometimes sketching, sometimes just letting the light spill across the floor. There was a steadiness to those days that I hadn't felt in years. Not peace, exactly, but the kind of stillness that comes when nothing feels like it needs to be defended anymore. I didn't have to justify my mother's worth. I didn't have to correct the stories my family had rehearsed. Her truth had already spoken, and it was louder than any performance they could stage. One morning in late October, I received a letter in the mail. Not an email, not a form letter, but a handwritten envelope with no return address. Inside was a folded sheet of paper in my father's handwriting, something I hadn't seen since I was a teenager. The lines were neat, rehearsed, but carried a hesitation I didn't expect. He didn't apologize, not directly. He didn't mention the forged deed, the funeral, or the words he threw at me like stones. But he said he was leaving Portland for good, that he had sold his remaining shares in the construction company and was moving to Arizona to start over. He said, "I wasn't good to her. I won't pretend otherwise now." And then, almost at the bottom of the page, he wrote, "You were always more like her than I knew. That used to scare me. Now I think it's why you'll be fine." I folded the letter and placed it inside one of my mother's journals. I didn't write back. I didn't tell anyone I had received it. It wasn't closure, and it wasn't forgiveness. It was just a page, a moment, something marked and then placed aside. I didn't need more than that. A few days later, Emily called. The probate process was officially complete. All assets were transferred, and the estate was closed without contest. I thanked her for everything, and before we hung up, she said, "Your mother would have wanted you to live forward now, not just look back." I knew she was right. So that afternoon, I started drafting something I had always put off, a proposal for a small residency program for women artists over 40, designed for those who had put their creativity aside to raise families, support spouses, or survive in silence. It wouldn't be large, just 3 artists at a time, staying in the house for 8 weeks, painting in the converted studio, cooking in the same kitchen where my mother once stirred soup with one hand and mixed pigment with the other. I called it the second voice. I didn't tell many people, just Rebecca and Emily at first, and the center director who had hosted the exhibit. The idea caught on faster than I expected. Within a month, I had 10 inquiries and 3 applications that moved me to tears. One was from a retired nurse who had sketched every night after double shifts but never shown her work. Another from a widow who said her husband used to laugh at her poems. I didn't choose based on skill. I chose based on silence, the kind that deserved to become sound. In December, the first 3 women arrived. I greeted them one by one at the front door, showed them to their rooms, and watched as they explored the space like it was sacred. And in many ways, it was. Not because it was filled with expensive things or legacy furniture, but because every wall held something my mother had touched. That first night, we sat around the table eating lentil stew and sharing nothing too deep. Just small things, favorite colors, childhood memories. One woman mentioned how she hadn't used oil paint in 20 years. Another said this was the first time she'd been in a room with other artists since college. I didn't say much. I just listened. After they went to bed, I stood in the studio alone. The walls were still lined with my mother's last paintings, and the window was fogged from the cold outside. I pressed my hand to the glass, closed my eyes, and whispered into the quiet, "I'm still here, and so are you." It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't even grief. It was just a truth settling into the floorboards, into the brush handles, into the space where art is born not to be sold, but to be heard. I didn't expect the house to feel more alive with other people in it, but it did. Each of the women brought something with them that softened the corners of silence. One sang while she cooked, off-key but joyful. Another hung her drawings on the hallway walls, not for display, just to feel them breathe. The third sat every morning at the kitchen table, writing long letters to no one, folding them neatly into a box she didn't label. I didn't ask questions. I just kept the coffee hot and the windows open. The old cedar walls, once worn down by years of quiet restraint, now carried a different kind of quiet, one born not of fear, but of freedom. By mid-January, the studio had become something entirely new. It still held traces of my mother, but it no longer belonged only to the past. Laughter sometimes spilled out through the door, sometimes tears. There were arguments over shade and texture, over the courage to begin a new piece when your hands were stiff from years of not being allowed to try. I saw one woman break down over a color she hadn't touched since her 20s, her hands trembling as she mixed it again. I didn't interrupt. I just placed a clean cloth beside her and sat on the floor until her breathing slowed. Healing doesn't come with ceremony. It comes in slow, unpredictable ways, like how sunlight eventually finds the back corner of a room you forgot to dust. A few local artists began to notice what we were doing and asked if they could stop by. I kept the door closed to the public, but opened it to those who understood the purpose, not gallery owners or critics, but women who had lived long enough to know how easy it is to disappear inside your own life. I watched as the house, once a place I associated only with resentment and grief, became a place of permission. The kitchen was no longer where my mother stood cooking in silence. It was now a space where stories were exchanged over soup and fresh bread, where no one apologized for taking up time or space or air. The living room, once where my father had held court with visiting clients, now hosted late-night critiques, coffee-ringed notebooks, and spontaneous music from a second-hand speaker someone brought in from the thrift store. On the final night of the first residency, we held a small showing, nothing formal, no invitations, just the women, a few friends, and a table of snacks someone insisted on arranging like it was a wedding. Each woman spoke briefly about what she had created, not to explain it, but to stand next to it and say, "This is mine. I didn't present anything. I just lit the candles and swept the floor beforehand," watching them speak, unshaken, unhurried. I saw something my mother never got in her lifetime, not just space to create, but space to be believed. And that, more than anything, felt like the full circle she had been hoping for after everyone left. I stayed behind to clean. It was nearly midnight when I walked back into the studio, turned off the lights, and sat alone in the chair she used to favor. The air was still, but warm. I reached for the last journal she had written in, the one I had never opened. On the final page, written in soft pencil, were just 3 lines. "If you're reading this, I'm proud of you, even if no one claps, even if no one calls. Let this be enough. You heard me." I sat with those words longer than I'd planned, not crying, not shaken, just full, like someone who had finally come home to a place that no longer asked her to shrink. The next morning, I stepped outside and stood at the edge of the porch. The trees were bare, but the light was changing. I could feel spring in the air, just underneath the cold. I didn't know what would come next. Maybe I'd expand the program, maybe I wouldn't. Maybe I'd paint again someday, or maybe just keep holding the door open for others. But one thing was certain. I no longer carried her story in secret. I lived inside it, and in doing so, I had rewritten my own. Maybe that's what true justice looks like, not revenge, not silence broken for applause, but a life rebuilt without shame, a life that doesn't beg to be seen, because it no longer depends on anyone's permission to exist. If you've ever been told your voice wasn't worth hearing, or your truth was inconvenient, let this be proof. Sometimes you don't need to shout to be heard. You just need to hold the mic when it matters most.